Today we're going to talk about a very simple way to climb out of a creative rut. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. This is Dylan Golby. Now, a couple of weeks ago I showed some images from a trip to India a couple of years back, and I mentioned that I'd been up in the mountains of Arunachal Pradesh and then I'd come back down to Delhi. Now, when I came back down to Delhi from that very simple lifestyle in the mountains of basically living outdoors, cooking my own meals, and not being surrounded by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people all the time, getting back into Delhi was a little bit of a shock to the system, and I had a real sort of hard time trying to compose images while I was there. Everything was just a little bit overwhelming. It was hot, it was noisy, it was what Delhi is, but it wasn't what I was used to from being up in the mountains for so long. So I had a lot of difficulty, and I want to walk you through how I basically overcame that and started to make images again. When it comes to getting out of a creative rut, the first thing that we often need to do is to recognize that we're in a creative rut. We need to be able to recognize that it's not the place that we're in that's stopping us from making photographs. It's not our equipment that's stopping us from making photographs. It is ourselves and our own creativity that's being limited by something. And if we can figure out what that something is, we can often try and change it and get ourselves back into the flow of making images. So for me, once I've recognized that, I'm having difficulty making images and it's not the outside world that's doing that to me, I'll often do something like change a lens, or sit down, have a cup of coffee, get in a taxi, take a ride across the city, and just stare out the window until I see something that interests me, jump out and go and shoot it. These sorts of things can help just shake up the way that you're doing things, the way that you're seeing the place that you're in, allow your mind just to settle a little bit and start seeing rather than looking for things. But today I wanted to share with you something very simple that we can all do to get ourselves seeing differently. Now, I've found that when I'm struggling, one of the things that I can do to get myself really thinking differently again is to place a constraint on myself. Now, with most cameras, we can change the aspect ratio that we're shooting in. So with, let's say, a Fujifilm X camera or a full-frame camera, the default ratio is 3:2, the size of the sensor, and with something like the GFX cameras, it is 4:3. Now, with most cameras we can change that, but with mirrorless cameras, because we have the EVF and the rear LCD, we actually get a preview of that particular aspect ratio that we've changed in the viewfinder, and it can help us to basically cut out the parts of the world that may be distracting us from our compositions. With the GFX series of cameras, I love to work with the 65:24 panoramic crop mode, and that's a very long and thin crop, and it allows me to be sort of seeing the world in a different way because it's so far removed from the native aspect ratio of 4:3. Now, I recently sold my GFX 50R, and in order to buy the GFX 100S, it's not in stock yet, but Fujifilm have sent me this lovely metal grip that will go on the camera that they haven't got in stock yet. So you'll have to, take my word for it in this video that the menu system, at least this part of the menu system, for the GFX is exactly the same as on the X100V. So we'll use this as an example. So let's take a look at how we can switch that crop preview in the Fujifilm cameras. Now, if you're a RAW shooter with Fujifilm, this can be a little bit counterintuitive because you do actually need to be in RAW plus JPEG or just JPEG shooting to be able to change the aspect ratio. Now, that's a little bit counterintuitive, and for someone like me who never uses the JPEGs anyway, it's just sort of a waste of card space, and I hope that Fujifilm can actually update this in the future to allow us to select those aspect ratios and then just apply that as a flag in the RAW file rather than having to save a JPEG as well. But I digress. Let's get into how to actually do this. So the first thing that you'll need to do is go into the menu and go into the image quality menu. From there, if you're just shooting RAW, you'll notice that the first item, image size, is actually grayed out and you can't select it. So you'll need to go into the image quality menu first and choose either a JPEG mode or a RAW plus JPEG mode. So I usually just go with normal plus RAW, as I don't want to waste the memory card space, and I'm going to throw these away anyway. and then we can go into the image size now that we have that enabled. And from there you can actually change to small, medium or large JPEGs. So if you're going to be keeping the JPEGs, you can basically make a choice, but I will usually go with a small JPEG and then choose the ratio that I want. Now with the X cameras you only have 3:2, 16:9 and 1:1, which is a square ratio. With the GFX cameras you have quite a few more crops that you can choose from, like 6:7 and 65:24. Once we've set our desired ratio, the EVF and the LCD on the back will both begin to preview that ratio. So if you've set 1:1, you'll have two black bars down the side of here and down the sides of your EVF to help you compose specifically in a square. Now this can be useful if you know that your output is going to be a square or a 16:9. You can change this to just sort of help yourself compose. It's also really useful for the reasons that we're talking about today, just getting yourself back into the swing of things. So rather than digging into the menus to change this, as I use it quite frequently, I've actually got it in the quick menu of all my cameras. So with a long panoramic crop like 65:24, we're encouraged to work in a horizontal format. There aren't that many subjects that work really well with, say, a vertical frame when you're doing something that long, and it can also be difficult for people to view these days, as most people are working on either a horizontal monitor or a tiny phone screen. So it's really difficult to be able to compose a vertical frame that will work well. So since we're basically forced into working in a horizontal crop, it can also be difficult if you're trying to photograph, say, a taller subject, because we need to move back so far to be able to get a lot of that subject in that we end up introducing a lot of clutter around that subject. Now that may not be such a problem if you're thinking about doing a landscape and you've got boring clouds, so you've decided to crop those out and just go for a really long scene of the mountains or something like that, or the ocean. But if you're in a city photographing people, stepping back to get any more than just a face in can actually get a lot of additional stuff into the frame that you then need to deal with in terms of composition. However, if we can find some sort of dominant horizontal lines or something in the composition, we can make really interesting shots in the city as well. For example, if I'd been photographing this scene in 3:2 ratio, it's likely that I would have tried to get close to one of the cellars and simplify that frame just down to one activity. However, with the 65:24 panoramic composition, I can step back, get a lot more of that scene in, and include a lot more characters to tell a different story. So I often like to include multiple characters in these long, thin scenes because it can sort of help you to tell stories that link those characters together. And occasionally I'll get, lucky like I did in this frame from Hanoi, where I actually end up with similar gestures from these two people. The other great thing about that here is that because I was so close to this gentleman, I was able to actually take his head and the rest of him out of the frame and just have his arm mimicking what we see the lady doing in the background. This also helped to remove a lot of the clutter, as anyone who's been to Vietnam will know that those tea shops can have a lot of stuff on the tables. So as I said, I like to try and look for relationships between subjects when it comes to these long, thin frames. In this shot from Varanasi, it's likely that I would never have photographed it if I didn't have the 65:24 crop enabled. While I could definitely see these two characters, there was bright sky above the man on the right and a messy sign above the man on the left, and I wouldn't have likely looked at a composition that would include both of them because there'd just be too much extraneous information, too many distractions in the frame. But by taking this long, thin look at things, I could cut both the ground and the sky out and just have these two men in the composition. So this ability to look for things that are next to each other but not necessarily in close proximity really gives you a sort of a different way to look at the world and can sort of get you out of that creative rut, that creative block, and allow you to start seeing relationships a little bit differently within the composition. One freedom that comes with having such a long, thin crop is that we don't necessarily need to have a single dominant subject, so the scene itself can actually become the subject. Especially if we have strong horizontal lines, this can work really well, and the scene can become the subject in and of itself. This was especially useful when I was in Varanasi and having trouble sort of composing so that I could show the expanse of the place. For example, this image from one of the guts takes in the bathing, the boats, the makeshift shelters, and even a bird flying over the river. However, none of those is a dominant subject. Personally, I find that this type of image tends to work better in a panoramic crop than it does in a standard crop. One other use for this crop is to be able to shoot detail shots. Now, typically when we think about details, we're thinking about, getting in close and filling the frame with a specific detail. But with a panoramic like this, we can actually keep that detail in part of the frame and let the rest of the frame just fill with other little things to support a bit of a story. This sadhu pouring water from the Ganges over his possessions would have lacked the impact it does if I got too close and not included the space around him. We wouldn't have been able to see, his legs, the boats in the background. We would have just been looking straight at the water and him pouring it over. The other thing about this crop is that it makes him anonymous, just like the man I showed from the Hanoi tea stall before, and that allows us to focus specifically on the activity that he's doing and not so much on who he is. Changing the aspect ratio in camera is one way that I like to pull myself out of a creative rut. As you can see, it does help you to see very differently. It helps you to be able to compose images in a bit of a different way, and just gets those creative juices flowing again. I was having a lot of trouble making images when I came back from the mountains down into Delhi, and this simple thing of just placing the constraint of a different crop that I don't normally work in, something that's very far removed from my regular workflow, allowed me to just get to start seeing the world again and start getting my brain just ticking and making a different kind of image. So I'd be interested to hear in the comments if you guys have ever used a similar technique to get yourself out of a creative rut, and if not, what sort of things do you employ to get yourself just making images again when you really don't feel it? As always, thanks for watching, and I hope this video has been useful for you. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up below, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, I'd really appreciate it if you would. Thanks again, and see you in the next one.